What are you willing to pay for more power and influence? You are already more powerful in potential than you can believe. So what will it take? Professor Charles Dwyer will guide you through a seminar of self-discovery that will help you identify ineffective behaviors while sharing with you techniques to design new behaviors that will get you what you want.
The number one reason you and I aren't significantly more effective in dealing with people than we are now is because we're not willing to do what works.
This seminar focuses on the issue of why we choose the path of least neurological resistance. Until you face these obstacles and learn how to overcome them, you cannot increase your effectiveness. Other programs tend to focus on comfortable, safe techniques. This is no Managing Fat of the Month club. Instead, Professor Dwyer shares his 40 years of experience in finding and developing these effective techniques, which are infinitely more powerful, but considerably more psychologically costly and risky.
And the reason we're not willing to do what works is because there are certain ego costs and ego risks that we were taught when we were about 5 or 6 or 7 years old not to take.
Professor Dwyer has decades of immersion in corporate and organizational consulting, as well as executive education. His client list includes IBM, DuPont, Xerox, AT&T, PepsiCo, Caterpillar, Pitney Bowes, General Motors, Nabisco, Mercedes-Benz, Intel, the FBI Academy, as well as several U.S. government offices. We'd like you to take our word for it. However, if you want extra proof, listen to what prominent executives have said about his seminars. Daniel O'Brien of the Columbus Cabrini Medical Foundation called it outstanding, indispensable if you want to grow and change. James Cobb of Arco Chemical describes Professor Dwyer's seminar as a real and challenging tool. Richard Capalbo of Merrill Lynch called it the best of the best.
You can be as powerful as you're willing to pay.
So welcome to your first day of your journey to power.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Well, we're here today to talk about power and influence. Is that a topic of interest? Anyone here?
Yes.
Just a tad here and there. As some of you know, my way of thinking about organizations is to suggest that they fundamentally consist of resources, or what I call potential value satisfaction, something we'll be talking about a lot today, and seekers, human beings, seekers after value satisfaction, and then power. And power is the third element, the adjudicatory mechanism in organizations. It's what determines which seekers get which resources and which value satisfactions. So that's sort of the broad context within which this topic of power and influence, I think, is of some interest. My assumption here today is that you folks, in fact, want more power. And again, let me do a little reality check here for a moment. Maybe you're not like me. Is there anybody here who has too much power, too much influence in your organization? It's a burden. You're a danger to yourself and others? Not a problem. Anybody here have just enough you wouldn't want any more? Then can I assume you're just like me, you want more power? You want more power to do what? Why, the right thing, of course. The right thing according to whom? Me. So we reasonably clear on that? Now, when I talk about power and influence, I really am almost using them synonymously. Because for me, in organizational context, power is influence. Why? Virtually everything that you and I want out of any organization is under the control of someone else. If they behave in a certain way, we get what we want. If they don't, we don't. I'm in a university context. Who is it that controls much of what I want in the way of value satisfaction? Well, the dean, and my fellow faculty members, and my secretary, and my students, and the support staff. And if they'll behave in certain ways, if they'll take certain actions, if they'll produce certain performances, then the quality of my life is enhanced. If they don't, then there's a diminution in the quality of my life. So I'm going to, in a sense here today, use the words power and influence almost interchangeably. And what we want to do is take a good look at what influence is all about. And we have an advantage there. How long in your life have you been influencing people? Since day one, or shortly thereafter. And as a matter of fact, we have a new grandchild, and my daughter-in-law tells me that our granddaughter, in fact, began influencing before birth. If she didn't like something, she let her mother know. So what's curious about this topic, in a way, is that we've all been influencing people, certainly since shortly after birth, and maybe even before that. And what today is about is finding out what that's all about. What have we been doing? When it succeeded, why did it succeed? When it failed, why did it fail? How can we get better at using whatever we have available to us to get other people to engage in the behaviors and produce the performances that we want? So, there's some good news and some bad news about how to get anyone to do anything you want. And I'm going to give you both. But I think I'll give you the bad news first. We might as well go with the familiar, and then we can end on a high. What's the bad news about how to get anyone to do anything you want? The bad news is there's no magic. Now, you don't look crestfallen. Well, I didn't think there was magic. Oh, yes, you did. Everybody believes in magic, but they're not allowed to use the term magic because that doesn't sound sophisticated. I mean, we're all professionals heading into the 21st century. I don't believe in magic. Yes, you do. And you desperately want magic. Everybody wants magic in human influence. What do I mean by magic? I mean no cost, no risk, guaranteed ways of getting people to do what you want them to do. What sort of magic have you been exposed to? And some of you have been around long enough to have been exposed to a lot of it. We have any victims of MBO here, Management by Objectives? Do you remember that one? Well, we've got some of those victims. Any perpetrators? Do you remember matrix management? Zero-based budgeting? Quality control circles, autonomous work groups, job rotation, job enlargement, job enrichment, industrial democracy, participative management, and strategic planning? And I assume these days you are probably in the throes of TQM, or continuous quality improvement. People are always coming up with the management fad of the month. Get the incentive system right. Get the right organizational design. Now, I'm not hostile to those ideas. I use those ideas in my own consulting work. The issue is that they're often put forward, and I fear even more often accepted, as though they're magical ways. Get the right structure, and people will behave the way you want. Get the right incentive structure. Get the right MBO in there. Get the right total quality management program in there. But as I assume most of you know, you want a real TQM, you want continuous quality improvement, you're looking at a 5 to 7 year significant commitment in that organization, and most people are not prepared to do that. So what do? They play it like magic. They go to the managerial supermarket and they grab something off the wall and they bring it back and they bring a few consultants in and they put some posters up on the walls and they have a couple of retreats and say, hey, we've got one of those, we're au courant, but it isn't serious. And again, it reinforces this notion that there's some magical recipe out there that you can use. There's no magic. I have been studying human behavior, human influence in organizations full-time for about 35 years. If there were magic, I'd have it. If I had it, I wouldn't be here. Didn't you ever wonder about those seminars where they promise you $1 million in real estate with no money down? Didn't you ever wonder about the people who conduct the seminars? I mean, why is it they're not out there taking their own advice? Instead, they're here creating competitors for themselves. My assumption is there's more money in giving the advice than there is in taking it. But nonetheless, we all want the cost-free, risk-free, guaranteed way of getting people to do what we want them to do. And there is no such thing. There's more to the bad news. Do you have any idea what the number one obstacle is for you in taking the quantum leap in interpersonal effectiveness, in power, in influence? The number one obstacle. Any ideas? Ourselves. What about ourselves?
Risk of failure.
Risk of failure. Put another word in front of that. There is a risk of failure. Why would that deter us? Because we have something else called fear of failure. Fear of rejection, fear of embarrassment, as we will see today. The number one reason you and I aren't significantly more effective in dealing with people than we are now is because we're not willing to do what works. And the reason we're not willing to do what works is because there are certain ego costs and ego risks that we were taught when we were about 5 or 6 or 7 years old not to take. Indeed, do you have any idea at what age in your life you were probably at your maximum effectiveness in influencing people? Any guesses?
Infancy.
Infancy? Well, let's target that with a year. 3. Very good, Stacy. When we're 3 years old, you watch a 3-year-old and see how effective a 3-year-old is at getting what he or she wants. Why? Because they're willing to do some things that are incredibly effective in influencing human behavior that you and I aren't willing to do. And some of those things, by the way, are socially acceptable. But they will be socialized out of those behaviors, out of those powerful techniques by the time they're 5 or 6. We'll see what some of those are today. You can be as powerful as you're willing to pay. That's really what it comes down to. And one of the things we'll be doing here is laying out those costs and risks in excruciating detail. And you can sit back and say, well, yeah, I wanted to be more powerful, but is that what it's going to cost me? Yeah, that's what it's going to cost you. So you decide. That's the bad news. What's the good news? The good news is much shorter than the bad news, but it's pretty good news nonetheless. The good news is that you don't have to study human behavior for 35 years to figure out what to do. The good news is that you have most of the knowledge that you need. You have most of the skill you need. No esoteric stuff is necessary. And whatever you don't have in the way of knowledge and skill, you'll have by the end of today's session. It's not a big deal. It's understanding a few relatively simple key concepts and then say to yourself, am I willing to do the stuff that works? And if you are, you can be more powerful tonight if you want to. You can be more powerful on the phone this afternoon if you want to. It's a matter of willingness, and that's pretty good news. So, that's the bad news and the good news. What are some of the categories that we have created to talk about human influence? Marketing, sales, advertising, merchandising, display of materials in retail outlets, politics, religion, parenting, spousing, negotiation, conflict resolution. What do they each involve? Those seemingly disparate categories, what do they each involve? What do they have in common? We'll play a Sesame Street tune here, huh?
Influencing someone's behaviors.
Influencing someone's behavior. Other words or phrases you'd like to use in describing what marketing, sales, advertising, politics, religion.
Persuasion.
Persuasion.
Selling.
Selling.
Convincing.
Convincing. Okay. Well, let me take the various words you've used and those categories and then begin to talk about how I see those, because I see them, again, in a quite idiosyncratic way. They each involve some individual human being somewhere engaged in one or more behaviors designed by that human being to influence the behavior of one or more other human beings. Now take sales, marketing, advertising, politics, religion, parenting, spousing, conflict resolution, negotiation. Do they all have that in common? I think so. Now that particular definition or description that I've given to all of those categories may seem unremarkable to you, but they guide us in very specific directions. Issue number one, when you're trying to influence someone, what is it you say you want from them? How do you think? How do you frame what you want from other human beings? What sorts of words do you use in describing what you want? What do you say? I want more. Give me some examples. I need, but what is it you want from the other person?
You want that person to change his behavior.
You want him to change your behavior.
And I wish you would clean up your room.
I wish you would clean up your room, okay? You ought to clean up your room. Oh, no, we have an imperative.
Just study more.
Study more.
I want a commitment from you.
Commitment, there's a good word. What other sorts of words do you have in your repertoire of things that you want from other people? What do you want from your children? What do you say you want from your children?
Respect.
Respect.
Obedience.
Obedience. Possibly a bit of groveling here and there, right?
Loyalty.
Loyalty. You want that from your children. You also want that from your subordinates, don't you? What do you want from your boss, those of you who have bosses?
Respect.
Respect.
Support.
Support.
Well, you also want tangible rewards.
Tangible rewards.
Give me a bigger salary.
Bigger salary.
Give me a bigger bonus.
Okay.
I earned it.
Intangible rewards as well.
Intangible as well. Do you have any idea? Let's pick one of those up. Do you have any idea what a lot of Americans would say they want from their boss? One of those possibly intangible. The opposite of it is micromanagement. Huh? Autonomy. Americans in particular want a sense of control over what they do. We want cooperation from colleagues. We want initiative. We want creativity. We want punctuality. That's the way we tend to have been taught to talk about what we want from other people. But that violates the description I just gave you of sales, marketing, advertising, etc., etc. How does it violate that? Huh? What did I say? I said each one of those activities involves some individual somewhere engaged in one or more behaviors designed by that individual to influence the behavior of one or more other individuals, with very few exceptions, most of them that came from Don. Were you giving me behaviors? There's a great curiosity in human influence. When you decide that you're going to spend some time and energy trying to influence someone, a spouse, a boss, a peer, a customer, what has led you to the belief that it is a good investment of your time and energy to try and influence that person? What evidence do you have that they aren't already where you want them to be? How do you know your boss isn't giving you enough autonomy? How do you know your children aren't respecting you? How do you know you're not getting cooperation from your colleagues? How do you know those things?
Current perception.
Perception of what? What are you perceiving? Literally, physically in the world, what are you perceiving?
Behavior.
Behavior. What you and I do is we pick up a few data fragments of other people's behavior and we draw grand conclusions in our heads about their attitudes and dispositions, their motivations. We attribute all kinds of characteristics to their personalities and to their mental states on the basis of a few fragments of behavior. You go to influence the boss or the child or the peer or the client. How do you know if you were successful? How do you know if they've changed their attitude? What's your evidence?
Their behavior.
Their behavior. You take in a few new data fragments of the behavior and say, oh boy, Bill has really turned around. It really is amazing how fragmentary this stuff is. But what's interesting about this description is we start with behavior, we end with behavior, and in between we've been taught in a kind of pseudo-Freudian way to talk about motives and attitudes and dispositions and personality characteristics. He has an attitude. So does everybody else. So one of the lessons in human influence that I think is important is to try and get very concrete and specific either about observable behavior or measurable performance. Try to stop talking about attitudes and dispositions and generalized characteristics of other human beings. It is critical to focus in on and understand that which is observable without making all kinds of attributions about what's going on in somebody's head. So lesson one, focus in on the measurable and observable. But my statement had another reference to the word behavior in it that I think is incredibly important. I said each of those things, the marketing, sales, etc., involve some individual human being somewhere engaged in one or more behaviors designed by that individual to influence the behaviors of other people. So when you think about power and influence, think about what you have available to you to influence someone else. And there are lots of answers to that question. What do you have available to you? Why, I have knowledge, skill, experience, authority, my position. And that's what people usually say when I ask that question. Well, I've got a certain amount of experience, I know some things, I have some skills. But those things don't make any difference until they're turned into what? Behavior. One of the ways to think about human influence is to understand that all you have available to you to influence the behavior or performance of any of the 5.3 billion people on the face of the earth, the data fragments of your own behavior. What does that tell us? We have to focus much more intensively, consciously, reflectively, introspectively on the data fragments of our own behavior. What we say and when we say it and how we say it and where we say it, and the gestures and the tone and the intonation. It turns out that those data fragments are more than adequate to the task. But it also leads us to an inescapable conclusion. If you want to get more effective in dealing with people, if you want to increase your power and influence in organizational contexts, what is the inescapable conclusion since all you have are the patterns of your own behavior? What are you going to have to do? Change your own behavior. And people sort of get annoyed there and say, well, I'm not the one that needs to change. He's the one who needs to change. Sorry. You want to get more effective? What are you going to have to do? Change the patterns of behavior, the data fragments. All of them, of course not. You're already effective, or you wouldn't be in the positions you're in. But if you want to take a significant jump in your effectiveness, then you have to alter the only thing you have available to you to influence anybody, and that's your own behavior. Now, there's a little scene I like to use to illustrate this from the film Charade. Okay? Turns out Walter Matthau, I don't want to spoil this for you, but Walter Matthau's a bad guy. But he doesn't want to appear to be a bad guy. And so he wants to lead Audrey Hepburn to a certain conclusion about who he is and where he stands in this whole case that she's involved in. So he arranges to have her come to a government office at noon. Of course, everybody's out to lunch. What does he do? He slips into the office. The person who occupies the office is gone. The secretary is gone. What I want you to do is watch these data fragments. He sends out some words, some gestures, and those data fragments are beautifully designed to convince the audience, because you don't know he's a bad guy at that time, and to convince Audrey Hepburn that he is who he says he is. And what it demonstrates is how we take in data fragments all the time and draw conclusions. He goes to a cabinet and takes out sandwiches that obviously have to be fresh sandwiches. He walks around the desk. He pops the cork on the wine. Later on, he has a picture of himself and his wife on the desk. He opens a drawer and takes out some photographs. Would any of us believe that wasn't his office and he wasn't who he said he was? Now, again, I'm not telling you to go about deceiving people. What I'm pointing out is you and I live in a world of these tiny data fragments. And if we want more power, if we want more ability to influence people, we have to become more self-conscious about what those data fragments are, and not the intent behind them, not the truth and reason upon which they're based, but how they're being processed in the mind of the person whom we're trying to influence. So much of what we're going to be looking at today is, hey, how do we get better at designing the patterns, and you'll see my reason for using the word patterns, the patterns of behavior that we use out there in the world to increase our effectiveness, so that when those data fragments hit people's central processing unit and whirl around in there, they conclude that doing what we want them to do is the best thing they can do to take care of what's important to them. And that's what influence is all about. So let's begin to see what this world of influence is all about in terms of the first act of influence you ever engaged in. I'm going to use this word values several times today. I use that word somewhat differently than most people. Part of what I mean by it is what most people mean by it, that set of intrinsic value satisfactions that are put into your head by the culture generally between birth and about age 7. What do we learn to want? We learn to want security. We learn to want respect and status and autonomy and esteem and acceptance and approval and achievement and success and excitement and challenge and fun. That's all learned, and different kinds of values are learned differently in different cultures. Well, that's what most people mean by the word intrinsic value, or the phrase intrinsic values. But because I want to use that concept values to not only describe and explain behavior, but eventually to influence it, I have to expand the coverage of the concept to include what I would call hardwired, DNA-based, genetically determined values. Now, you're probably more comfortable with the word needs, huh? Do we come into the world neutral, or do we come in with needs, wants, desires, predilections, and preferences? We don't come in neutral, do we? I like to use the word values rather than the word needs to describe those hardwired states, because having been involved in raising 4 children, I tired very early on of their trivialization of the word need. For those of you with children, do you understand? They only have one level of desire, that without which they will expire. I need the car, I need $50, I need to go to the rock concert, I need those Nike Airs, whatever it is, I need it. Okay? And I really didn't like that. So every time I use the word values, think of it as having these 2 components. The hardwired set, which you may want to translate into the word needs, and then the acquired set, the enculturated set that takes place basically between birth and about age 7. So we come into the world with needs that never leave us, values I will call them, and then the culture comes in and puts another set on top, and that set is pretty well sealed in content by the time we're 7 years old. It may change in intensity and priority, but you're not going to put new intrinsic values in people's heads after they're about 7 years old. That turns out to be extremely important, as we'll see in a little while. So we're born with values, we acquire values. What else are we born with? Behaviors. Are there things you can do from day one? What sorts of behaviors are you able to engage with no learning whatsoever? What can you do when you're born? Cry. Breathe. You can see. You can observe. Hear. You can blink. You can dilate the pupils of your eyes. You can grasp. You can move your arms and legs. You can move your head. That's about it. It's sort of like the boot up program on a PC. Not a lot there, but enough to get it started. What is it we don't have very much of when we're born? Neurological connections between the brain and our value. Between our behavior and our values. You don't know how to use your behavior to serve your values when you're born, with one exception. It's a very interesting exception, by the way. You take a brand new infant and touch the hand or foot of a brand new infant with a sharp object, and what will the infant do? Absolutely automatically. Yeah. Pull away. It doesn't stay there. It doesn't push toward the source of the pain. It pulls back. You might say that's quite natural. It is natural. It's in nature. But it's the only one I know where a behavior is tied to a value. What's the value? Pain avoidance and comfort. What's the behavior? Pull back from a source of it. There are all sorts of other things that would be nice if they were hardwired in, but they're not. And much of what's going on inside of us as we're developing in our first 3 years of life is making more and more conscious connections between our behaviors and our values. You're a few days old. You're uncomfortable. You don't know why you're uncomfortable, but you are uncomfortable. You start to flail about, arms and legs moving. Coincidentally, you move your trunk. You're more comfortable. Guess what you just learned? Going like this makes you feel more comfortable. And what you continue to do is refine those patterns of behavior so that now, some of you may not be used to sitting this long, you get a little uncomfortable. I've seen no flailing about, so I assume that you've moved up the learning curve. What do? Grin and bear it? Well, that's part of it. What else do you do?
Move.
You just change your position a little bit. You stretch, you fold your arms, you cross your legs, you scratch your ear. You engage in a tiny behavior that is now virtually automatic for you in the service of your comfort value. Again, what development is very much about is developing linkages between your behaviors and your values. But now comes the part that's really interesting. Somewhere between, for most people, the 4th and 6th month of life, you discovered something really neat. You discovered that certain hardwired behavior on your part allows you to influence the behavior of other people who then take care of what's important to you. Now, that's pretty interesting for an infant. Why? Because nearly everything the infant values, to be fed, to be changed, to be warm, to be dry, to be picked up, to be held. Nearly everything the infant wants out of life requires the cooperation of someone else. And between the 4th and 6th month life, and this is pretty much across cultures, infants begin to discover that a certain behavior on their part allows them to influence the behavior of other people. Now, this isn't universal. This is cultural specific. But this particular behavior, and I'm sure it's already buzzing and humming around in your brain, this particular behavior is a very common hardwired behavior which is culturally understood to trigger generally parental response. What hardwired behavior on your part allowed you to influence the behavior of other people and get your values served? What's that hardwired behavior?
Crying.
Crying. The one you mentioned earlier, Stacy, that hardwired behavior. Crying. Management technique number 1. You might also look around your organization and discover people whose managerial repertoire has not increased significantly since their birth. When they want something, what do? Whine. Cry, grieve, moan, complain, make noise. Why do they do that?
Well, I've learned that gets results for them.
It works.
They wouldn't keep using it.
Why does it work? I'm trying to get personal here.
We want to shut them up.
We want to shut them up.
Get out of here.
But in my language, it works because we cooperate with it. Because we reward and reinforce it. Has it occurred to you that much, not all, but much of the irritating behavior in your life on the part of others exists only because you insist upon consistently rewarding and reinforcing it? Here's the sort of thing you and I do every day of our lives, and we don't seem to acknowledge it. We point back there and say, Dave, Dave, I've been watching your behavior here. It's a real irritant to me. Here's $50, Dave. I don't want you to do it again. If you do it again, I'll have to give you another 50. Dave is desperately trying to figure out what it was he did so he can do it again. If you don't want those irritants that exist because you're rewarding them, what are you going to have to do? Stop rewarding. Exactly. But that's not easy. We reward them because it shuts it up at that point in time with the absolute guarantee it'll be repeated in the future. And if I stop rewarding Dave's behavior, what's going to happen? He ain't going to like it. He isn't going to like it because I have just taken power away from him. He can no longer tap into me as a resource in that way to take care of what's important to him. So what's he going to do? What most 3-year-olds do. Escalate, intensify, and persist. And I got to stand there and say, no, this isn't going to work anymore until he gets tired of that and his brain finally says to him, hey, this doesn't work anymore. I better find another way of trying to influence Chuck. At a minimum, try not to reward irritating behavior. And if you insist upon rewarding irritating behavior, don't blame the other person for doing something that makes complete sense, tapping into you in a very effective way to take care of something that's important to them. Well, what is development all about? It's about learning more and more of those behaviors that work to get other people to take care of what's important to you. And fortunately, that learning doesn't have to stop at age 7, as the acquisition of intrinsic values does. You can learn new behaviors your whole life long. Now, let's take that back to what I said a little while ago. If you can begin consciously to design new patterns of behavior that we know are successful patterns of behavior in influencing the behavior of other people, you are, by definition, more powerful. Your power is the repertoire of behaviors available to you that you are aware of in a given situation of potential influence and that you're willing to use. And why might you not be willing to use them? Because you are aware of the costs and the risks that are involved. There are no free rides in the accumulation of interpersonal power. Now, wouldn't it be nice if I said, well, turn to your notebook, there are 437 behaviors listed there, memorize them, and you too can get anybody to do anything you want. Wouldn't that be nice? Why? Why can't I give you a recipe book? Why can't I just give you the cookbook of human influence?
Every situation's different.
That's right.
People are complex.
People are complex. Situations are different. All kinds of variables. Let's talk about 4 very complex variables that can interact. One, when you're trying to influence someone, what values are you trying to serve and what values are you trying to protect inside yourself? Each human being has their own idiosyncratic set of values that they're trying to serve and trying to protect. You may be trying to protect certain values, therefore there are certain things you won't do. I'm not trying to protect those values, therefore I'm willing to go and do them. One area of variability, our own value system and what we're trying to accomplish in a given situation. Variable number 2, what are the idiosyncratic tendencies and characteristics of the person I'm trying to influence? There are some certain generic traits, and we can talk about those, but hey, there are also some differences among people, and what works with one person isn't likely to necessarily work with another. Indeed, there's a dynamic. What works with Don today may not work tomorrow. What didn't work today may work tomorrow. So there's a dynamic out there that makes enormous differences. Third area of variability. What's the nature of the organizational relationship between you and the person you're trying to influence? I can assure you I use one set of behaviors with my dean, another set with my colleagues, and another set with my secretary, and another set with my students. Why? Because there's a series of understandings in their head and my head about this organizational relationship and who's supposed to do what and who's allowed to do what. Fourth area of variability. What's the nature of the interpersonal relationship between you and that person? What's the history? Is it a stranger? Then there are certain behaviors that are likely to work. Is it somebody you know? If it's somebody you know, is it a friend or an enemy? Is it somebody who likes you or doesn't like you? Is it somebody you trust or don't trust? As we'll see a little later today. If you trust somebody, there's a whole series of things you can do that you can't do if you don't trust them. There's a whole series of things that you can do if they trust you that you can't do if they don't trust you. So again, there's incredible variation out there among those 4 key variables, and that in their combination produces a mind-boggling set of possible interactions that you might have. Since I can't give you a list of behaviors like a cookbook or a recipe book, where can we go today? We can go to a series of frames, or now I will call them, for purposes of metaphor, lenses. Ways of looking at situations of potential human influence. And if you put these lenses on, these frameworks, these concepts on, and you start to look at situations of potential influence, you will see behaviors that otherwise would not occur to you. Behaviors that have a high probability, no guarantee, but a high probability of getting you what you want. But what again will be true of the behaviors that you discover when you put these lenses on? What will those behaviors imply for you, in addition to possible success? Costs and risks for you. You're going to have to change. We often say things like, oh, I've done everything. No, you haven't. And I'll come up and make a suggestion. Oh, I didn't think of that. Why didn't you think of that? Because it had costs and risks. Not because it might not work, because it had costs and risks. And your subconscious wouldn't even let that one up into the consciousness because it didn't want to take the risks that were involved. We'll see what some of those are. Because they're quite significant. And if we don't face them, they will operate at a subconscious level, and we'll end up with all kinds of reasons and excuses for not being effective in situations of potential power. One of the things you and I learned very early in our lives is that we cannot serve all of our values fully all the time. You can't take care of everything that's important to you fully simultaneously. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. One reason is some of our values may be in conflict. But a far more common garden variety reason is we have to use behavior to serve our values. Behavior requires time and energy. And as far as we know in human history, no one has ever discovered a single behavior at a given point in time that will simultaneously serve all of our values. So what must you and I do hundreds, if not thousands of times a day? Since we can't serve all of our values fully simultaneously, what do we have to do? Prioritize. Okay. What we used to do in my youth was choose, but prioritize is okay. Now, have you noticed you can't choose anything anymore? You have to prioritize. You can't use anything anymore. You have to utilize. It's sort of an inflation of the language to cover our lack of increased sophistication. We have to choose what? Which values we're going to attend to. You can attend to more than one. You just can't attend to all of them. Which values are we going to attend to? And then which behaviors are we going to engage in directly or indirectly in our attempt to serve those values? You're doing that all day long. You're doing it right now. You've been doing it ever since I walked up here. Don's doing it right now. Yeah. So's Dave. So's Bill. What am I talking about?
Gestures.
Gestures. Change of position. All I see is the behavior, but what is my assumption about the value you're attempting to serve when you make those gestures? One we talked about a little while ago. Comfort. Now, interesting issue. How do you go about making those choices or priorities? That is to say, what mental process do you use? Do you have any idea? You sit there and say, my left earlobe itches. I think in about 3.2 seconds I may scratch it. 1, 2, 3.2. Is that what you do? No, that's not how it's done. How is it done?
Automatically.
Automatically. Subconsciously. We have habits, programs, tapes, scripts, don't we? And something happens and bang, it goes to a certain pre-learned place in our head and we respond. Why? Why is that the way you do things?
It's efficient.
It's efficient. Why is it efficient? By the way, it doesn't matter how you answer a question, I'll always ask you another question. So just get used to my mode of interacting, all right? The reason most, not all, but most of what you and I do all day long is on automatic is because of the design of our brains. And when we're talking neurological structure here, that's why you and I make those subconscious automatic choices, programmatic choices the way we do. So if you don't mind, we'll put your brain up here for a moment. The human brain has a certain structure. I'm going to make a very simple and very old distinction between the consciousness and the subconsciousness. Now, we just talked about the subconsciousness. I'm going to include preconscious, unconscious. I just make this distinction. There's a consciousness, and then there's all the rest of that stuff in there. But the consciousness is extraordinarily tiny. So what do we have as a compensatory mechanism? Everything else. Again, I'm just going to sort of conveniently but somewhat inaccurately label the subconscious. What's in there? Well, all of the chemical processes, the maintenance of homeostasis, all kinds of things that go on in our brain that we'll never be aware of. But there's a set of things in there that I'm particularly interested in. It's all of our skills, our knowledge, our beliefs, our memories, our attitudes and behaviors. That's you too, isn't it? That accumulation of your life's experience. You have knowledge in your head, you have skills, beliefs, attitudes, and patterns of behavior. How many of you know how to drive a car, at least in your judgment? Can we see a show of hands on that one? Everybody knows how to drive a car? Very good. Have you ever been out on the highway and suddenly realized you've not been paying conscious attention for the last 25 miles? Panic seizes you. Where have I been? You've been someplace else. But you were probably driving safely. Why? You were on? Automatic pilot. A very efficient automatic pilot, as it turns out. If the brake lights of a vehicle in front of you light up, will that information get to your eyes? Will that send a signal to your brain? Will that cause a pre-established learned switch in the brain to close and send a signal down the body? And what will you do? Your foot will be on the brake before you're consciously aware your foot's on the brake. Our automatic behavioral programs are 7 to 12 times faster than our conscious behavior. You know that yourself if you've ever learned a new sport. Because when you learn a new sport, it's a behavioral program. Initially, what do you have to do?
Strike out.
Strike out. But more than that, you have to use your consciousness initially before you can put it in your brain as an automatic thing. And you have one of those bad friends who wanted to teach you to play golf, and they said, well, now what you do is you keep your eye on your ball, you keep the balance on both sides, you keep the left, you can't keep all that in your head. So you do one piece, and then you add another piece, and you add another piece if you have a good coach, or a good instructor. So, we've got the consciousness, tiny, fragile, fickle, easily distracted. The subconsciousness, huge, not limitless, but huge. And that's really a very effective combination, isn't it? I mean, if it weren't for that combination, you'd still be buttoning your shirt from this morning, Bill. Do you have any idea how complex a neurological event it is to learn how to button? Watch a little kid learn to button a button. But after you've done it a few times, automatic. You can be getting dressed, watching TV, thinking about something, driving in a car, holding a conversation. Well, gee, that sounds good. Yeah, it is. Except, most of the time when you and I are going out there trying to influence somebody, are we making conscious, deliberate choices from among alternatives? No. What are we on? Automatic. And what you'll discover is some of the automatic programs installed in your head and my head without our permission, before we had any critical faculty, are garbage programs. Remember that phrase I used earlier? Patterns of behavior? That's why I use the phrase patterns of behavior, because we're talking about automatic stuff. You have to change automatic patterns of behavior if you want to increase your effectiveness, because we're in situations of potential influence all the time. And we can't sit back and say, oh, I've got 17 alternatives here, let me check one. Sometimes we can, but most of the time we can't. So it has to be the automatic stuff flowing out of you in the normal interactions that you have all day that increase your effectiveness in dealing with people. For the most part, there can be some planning. We'll talk about that. But we've got some garbage programs to overcome in our brains. Again, put in without our permission before we had any critical faculty. And I want to show you one of those programs now. It's put into our heads when we're about 3 years old. I have never met anyone who escaped this programming. Let's see how it happened. Let's see. We don't have anybody here with a 3-year-old. I think I checked that earlier. We've got a 5-year-old and we have a 2.5-year-old. Huh? Well, for purposes of effectiveness, why don't we go with a 2.5-year-old, because we may be able to save this child. Is this a boy or a girl, Ted?
Beyond hope, Chuck.
Beyond hope.
Boy.
Boy. And his name?
Eli.
Eli. And when will Eli be 3? In another 6 months or so?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's take a look at Eli. Has Eli ever wanted something that he thought would serve his values, which required the cooperation of someone else, which he tried to get and didn't get? Has Eli ever not gotten something he wanted?
Yes.
It has happened. What emotions do you think Eli was feeling when he didn't get something he really had his heart set on? And again, everybody can join in this discussion. What do you think he was feeling inside?
Frustrated.
Frustration?
Angry.
Anger? Tad of rage, perhaps?
Just sad.
Sad? Disappointment? Alienation? Sure. We've all had those experiences many times, by 2.5 to say nothing of 3. So there's nothing unusual about not getting something you want, failing to influence someone. But some things are either happening to Eli now or will be happening sometime perhaps in the next 6 to 12 months. What the point I'm making here that's very important is that 2-year-old children don't have much sense of success and failure. They may end up with a little frustration, but they don't know about the societal definition of success and failure. And when they're about 3 years old, we start to put that in their heads as they see, oh, the agony of defeat on TV. They begin to see the joy of success. They begin to discover, however subtly yet powerfully, that this society is built on a notion of win-lose. It's built on concepts of success and failure. And Eli is understanding now, or soon will understand, failure is a bad thing. Failure is socially disapproved. And not only will he be developing an intellectual distinction between success and failure, he will be developing an affective component called fear of failure. This isn't universal against all cultures, by the way. But it's very, very dominant in here in Western civilization and industrialized civilizations in particular. So he's developing something called fear of failure. Next issue. Are you and others instructing Eli yet, and again it may be a bit early for a 2.5-year-old, are you instructing him yet in the cultural necessity of having reasons for things? Do you ever say, why did you do that, Eli?
I'm trying to avoid it.
You're trying to avoid it.
Yeah,
okay, so maybe you understand. When we ask a child, why did you do something, we are telling the child it's important for the child to create a reason. Okay, we pretend they already have a reason and they know what it is and they can tell us. Motivation is a very complex, subtle business. And what Eli is going to learn fairly soon is the distinction between parentally acceptable and unacceptable reasons, which is to say his parents will teach him to lie. Has it ever occurred to you how you learn to lie? Can an infant lie? No. He has to learn. How does it learn? Dad says, Eli, why'd you do that? Eli says, give Dad the real reason, he'll be off the wall again. Let's give him this one. He really likes this one. 3-year-olds know what gets rewarded and punished, and so they start to invent and concoct and create reasons. Fourth and finally, are you and others yet, again, Eli's only 2.5, but are you and others attempting to instill in Eli the values of acceptance, approval, self-esteem? Do you think you might be doing some of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Certainly.
One of the things you can do is put the values of acceptance, approval, and self-esteem in their heads, and then you can use a look of disapproval, withdrawal of approval as a way of influencing their behavior. Isn't that neat? Now let's put this together in a little scenario for Eli. He wants something. He wants to stay up late. He wants to watch a TV show. He wants a game. He wants a toy. He wants to go to the zoo. He wants an ice cream cone. He wants something that he believes will serve his values, which requires the cooperation of someone else. He has to be able to influence to get it. He tries and tries and tries. He doesn't get it. He has the familiar rush of negative emotions intensified with the knowledge he's done something socially disapproved. He's failed. But now that Eli, as he moves into being about 3 years old, Eli has to come up with a reason, not for Mom and Dad, a reason in his own head for his failure and frustration. And Eli has to come up with a reason acceptable to self-esteem. You know what Eli's saying? Gee, I'm no good, I don't deserve that toy. Some parents teach their kids that, and they end up needing psychiatric help at a relatively early age. Now, would you say that's a fairly complex psychological task for a 3-year-old child? Come up with a reason acceptable to self-esteem for failure and frustration in your life. I would say so. But since it happened to every one of us about age 3, the culture comes in and helps us in a way. It gives us a reason acceptable to self-esteem for failure and frustration. Now again, Eli's only 2.5, so Ted may not have heard this yet. And this has happened to Eli. Has he ever said anything like the following? Has he ever said, no fair, not fair? You heard those words from Eli yet?
Not yet.
Not yet. It's coming. So to a theater near you sometime in the next 6 months. You look at 3-year-olds and listen to them say that in that circumstance. Now, do you see what that does for Eli? It tells him the cause of this failure and frustration is where?
Somewhere
It's
else.
out there in the world. There's a defect in the world. It's a balm, it's a salve for Eli's burgeoning ego. It tells him he's okay. The reason he's failed, the reason he's frustrated is because of a defect out there in the world. You and I learn to say no fair, not fair when we're about 3 years old. When do we stop using it?
Never.
Shortly after death. Which, by the way, is also known as the final unfairness. The culture says you have to have a reason acceptable to self-esteem. I don't want to just keep saying not fair. They will, but they want to have a little variation in their lives. So what's the most obvious reason in the world that they're experiencing failures and frustrations?
Their mother.
There's a defect in their parents. That's right. Oh, that feels better. Now, I have good news for you. They'll stop doing that in their early to mid-20s, as all of my children have. Not because they're not not because they're no longer having failures and frustrations, but because we as parents are no longer plausible reasons why. We're no longer constraining their behavior. So what become the substitutes in the early to mid-20s? What become the reasons?
Their boss.
Their boss, their job, their system, the establishment, the red tape, City Hall, those intractable, intransigent, immoral, insensitive, negative, impossible people I have to deal with. You don't talk that way, do you? I mean, preferably over a cup of coffee with one or two colleagues who are more than willing to agree. After all, what are friends for? What is all that stuff? Eli saying no, fair, not fair. The adolescent and teenager saying it's my parents, it's my teachers. The adult saying it's the system, it's the boss. It's those egomaniacal people I have to deal with. It's the corruption out there. Rationalizations. Excuses, scapegoating. Now look inside your own head and say to yourself, hey, is that an automatic program in my head that's been played 10,000 times since I was 3 years old? Have I rationalized already today? Probably. You're going to rationalize before you go to bed tonight? Probably. It's a deeply embedded automatic program. And you say, well, so what? What's the big deal? Everybody has it. That's right. When you swim in a sea of mediocrity, you can look all right. What's wrong with rationalization is it deeply interferes with human effectiveness, influence, and power in 3 very specific ways. Number 1, when you rationalize, you tend to use the rationalization as a substitute for effective action. Your behavior is important to me. I can go out and try to influence you, but if I go out to try and influence you, what do I have to risk? Failure, rejection, embarrassment. There's another place I can go. It's warm and soft and fuzzy, well-supported and habitual. It's called rationalization. It's a substitute for action. I don't want to admit that I'm afraid to try and influence somebody, so rather than admit that I'm afraid to try and influence them, I say, you have any samples of this invisible kit of rationalizations you carry around with you all day?
Yeah, it was futile.
It was futile.
Yeah, he just won't accept that.
He won't accept that.
Yeah, he won't accept that.
Experts have tried to influence him and they fail. Why should I think I can? There are some people you can't change. I mean, you know, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You can make him damn thirsty before he gets there. Has that ever occurred to you? They're excuses, so we don't have to face our fear of failure and we don't have to go out there and try and influence somebody. And you think of how many times you've said that as a substitute for action. Second way in which rationalization interferes with effectiveness. You go out there and you try to influence someone. You give it a shot. And it doesn't work. And you're fresh from the pain of a failure. Now, you all know the old management, not only management, human bromide, but it's true. Persistence, persistence, persistence. You want to be effective, you've got to go back again. But you're feeling the pain of the failure you just experienced. So instead of going back in there and giving it another go and another go and another go and risking another rejection, another failure, what do you say to yourself? I mean, we are so clever at this subconscious level to keep us from doing things that have costs and risks.
How do you say things like, look, I gave it my best shot.
Gave it my best shot, one of my favorites. Do you see the logic of that? You probably never came close to giving it your best shot. You did something easy and safe and it didn't work, so you blamed him. But if you gave it your best shot, then there's obviously no point in going back and trying anything else. I mean, your best has already been used, hasn't it? What's the third way in which this program of rationalization keeps us from being effective? When we rationalize about people around issues of human influence, we almost always scapegoat them. We attribute negative characteristics to them. He's impossible. Just nobody could deal with her. When you begin to attribute negative characteristics to people as an excuse, as a rationalization, it will inevitably leak out of your behavior toward them, and they're going to pick up vibes. Hey, he doesn't like me. I don't know why. You've probably been the recipient of that sometime in your life. You probably are right now. Somebody you barely know doesn't seem to like you, and you're just puzzled by it. Why is it they don't like it? They've been scapegoating you. They've been using you as the reason they're not effective in the world. They're using you as the reason for their failures and frustrations. Well, that's going to keep happening, but what's something that doesn't have to keep happening is you don't have to keep doing it to other people. What you'll find in any organization, I certainly find it at the university, There are certain jobs, certain positions where whoever holds that position is going to get flack. They're the people who have to say no. Hey, the budget, hey, you're over budget. No, you can't change the budget category. No, you can't have those resources. And it almost doesn't matter who's in that position. A whole bunch of people then scapegoat them. I don't. What does that give me with respect to those people? Enormous potential power. Why? Because I will not scapegoat them. I won't blame them because I wasn't effective in getting what I wanted. And that means when I do want something from them, I have a much better chance of getting it than most of my colleagues who've been scapegoating them.